Hello dear viewers and subscribers of the channel. Today is September 16th, 2025, and this is a brief overview of the combat operations map. As of today, we have changes in Kamenske and Steppnohirsk. There are changes in the South Donetsk direction. In Pokrovsk, it is quiet for now. There are also significant advances by the Russian army in the Kostyantynivka direction. There are changes in the Siversk direction. In the Krasnyi Lyman direction, it is quiet for now. There are also changes in the Kupyansk direction. In the Kharkiv direction, it is also quiet. No changes are occurring along the entire line of contact. Combat operations are ongoing, and there are changes in the Sumy direction near Udachne and Orlivka. As always, we will discuss all of this starting from the south and moving north, but before you continue watching, be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new videos, and always stay up to date with the latest events and news. We will begin from the side of Kamenske and Steppnohirsk, as well as Primorske. As you know, Kamenske is completely under the control of the Russian army, and an active expansion of the control zone towards Stepove is currently underway. Information has also been received about the expansion of the control zone towards Steppnohirsk, and the Russian army has now entered the eastern outskirts of Steppnohirsk. At the moment, this entire territory, marked in grey, has already come under the control of the Russian army, and active combat operations are continuing on the southern outskirts of Steppnohirsk, as well as on the eastern outskirts, as most of this populated area is under the control of the AFU. In turn, Plavny has long been under the control of the Russian army, and now the armed forces of the Russian Federation are gradually moving towards Primorske. Some territories of this populated area have already come under the control of the Russian army, and active combat operations are continuing on the southern outskirts of this populated area. Let's zoom out the map and look at the Orikhiv direction. Regarding the Orikhiv direction from Stepove to Malinovka, there are no changes here for now along the entire line of contact. Active combat operations are ongoing. As soon as any updated information becomes available, we will definitely review this direction in more detail. For now, let's move to the South Donetsk direction towards Olgovskoye. Active offensive operations towards Poltavka are continuing, and active fighting is already underway on the outskirts of Poltavka. Today, information was received that Olgovskoye has come under the control of the Russian armed forces. The entire territory from Stepove to Olgovskoye, as well as to Novopavlivka and back, is completely under the control of the Russian army and has already been cleared. This entire pocket is currently under the control of the Russian armed forces. Timirovka is also under the control of the Russian army, as is the reverse side. However, in turn, the AFU are trying to counter-attack towards the reverse side, and active fighting is now taking place on the western outskirts of this populated area. However, the Russian army, in turn, continues its offensive actions towards Novopavlivka, and active combat operations are already underway in this populated area. Launches by FPV drone crews are also being conducted on AFU deployment sites in the populated areas of Khatnie, Novomykhailivka, Novopavlivka, Orikhiv, and other nearby populated areas. Let's move north on the map towards Sosnovka, Novomykhailivka, and Ternove. Most of Sosnovka is currently under the control of the Russian army. Novopavlivka, Sichnev, and Alexandrogorod are also under the control of the Russian armed forces, and all the territories from Novopavlivka to Alexandrogorod, or rather this small pocket of territory, have been cleared and are under the control of the Russian armed forces. Ternove is also under the control of the Russian army, as is Zaporizhzhia and most of Novomykhailivka. Active offensive operations are continuing towards Berezove, Kalinivska, and Stepove. And now, active combat operations are already underway on the northern and southern outskirts of Berezove. As not long ago, active offensive actions were conducted from the north and south on this populated area, and some territories north of the populated area of Berezove came under the control of the Russian army. Active offensive actions towards Stepove are also continuing. In turn, the Russian army is conducting launches with FPV drone crews on AFU deployment sites in the populated areas of Novopavlivka, Verbove, Oleksievka, Orestopil, Velikomykhailivka, and Lysne, and offensive actions towards the populated area of Lysne are ongoing. And let's move north on the map towards Andriivka-Klevtsovo. The situation here is clearing up a bit, and updated information on these populated areas is coming in. As you know, not long ago, counteroffensive actions were conducted by the AFU towards the populated areas of Zelenyi Hai, Tolstoy and Podubne, and some territories of Zelenyi Hai came under the control of the AFU. However, active fighting is now taking place in this populated area. Tolstoy is completely under the control of the Russian army, as is Podubne. However, active fighting is also taking place on the western outskirts of these populated areas, as there is AFU personnel present here, and active offensive operations in Andriivka-Klevtsovo by the Russian army are ongoing, and some territories, specifically the northern territories, are slowly coming under the control of the Russian army. But on the southwestern outskirts of this populated area, the presence of AFU personnel is still maintained, and these territories are under the control of the AFU. Active combat operations are ongoing. In turn, the AFU is trying to press in this populated area, but the Russian army is not yielding and also continues to press in this populated area. For now, we will monitor the developments in this populated area. Let's look at Ivanivka. Not long ago, active offensive actions were conducted from Zelenyi Hai towards Ivanivka, and FPV drone crews also launched attacks on AFU deployment sites in this populated area. And now active combat operations are taking place on the southern outskirts of this populated area, and all the territories from Zelenyi Hai, as well as to Udachne along the Volchya River, are currently cleared and are under the control of the Russian army, as is the populated area of Filia. However, in Filia, for over a week now, no information on the territories has been received, but active offensive operations towards Novopavlivka are ongoing. Also, on the northern side of the Volchya River, the presence of AFU personnel is maintained between Ivanivka and Filia, and combat operations are currently underway here. Also, regarding this huge pocket between Podubne, Tolstoy and Andriivka-Klevtsovo, the clearing of territories is still ongoing here. The Russian army is trying to press towards Andriivka-Klevtsovo, as well as towards Lisna, and is conducting launches with FPV drone crews on AFU deployment sites in the populated areas of Lisna, Pedavrilivka, and Havrilivka. We continue to monitor the developments in this direction and move northeast on the map. As you know, the territories from Udachne to Orikhiv have long been under the control of the Russian army, and now active offensive operations towards Novopavlivka from Udachne as well as from Filia are ongoing. In turn, Kotlyarivka is completely cleared and is under the control of the Russian army, as is most of Moravka. Active combat operations are continuing on the western outskirts of this populated area, as there is still a presence of AFU personnel here. Active combat operations are also underway in Bielinkivka and Novomykhailivka, and the territories south of Moravka have already been cleared and are under the control of the Russian army. Active offensive operations towards Novopavlivka are continuing, and as you know, this entire pocket is still under the control of the AFU, and now active offensive operations towards Novopavlivka are ongoing here, and the Russian army is gradually clearing this entire pocket, and the territories are coming under the control of the Russian army. And let's move on along the map towards Udachne. As of today, active combat operations are still ongoing in Udachne, and this entire populated area is gradually being cleared by the Russian army, and the territories are coming under the control of the Russian armed forces. Not long ago, there was a presence of AFU personnel in the northwestern outskirts of this populated area, but today these territories have come under the control of the Russian army, and active combat operations are now underway on the northern outskirts of this populated area, as there is still a presence of AFU personnel here, and counteroffensive actions by the AFU are ongoing. However, most of this populated area has already come under the control of the Russian army, and the Russian armed forces are gradually pressing, pushing the AFU back towards the forest belts and fields north of the populated area. In Kotlyne, there are also no changes for now. The entire populated area is under the control of the Russian army, but the AFU is trying to counterattack in this populated area, and now active combat operations are underway on the northern and northwestern outskirts of this populated area. The Russian army, in turn, is pressing in this populated area, and combat operations are continuing, but there have been no changes in the territories here for over a week. And let's move on along the map towards the Pokrovsk direction. Let's review it more briefly. The western outskirts of Pokrovsk are under the control of the Russian army, and active offensive operations towards the supply road leading to Pokrovsk are ongoing. Active combat operations are also underway in the center of Pokrovsk and in the south of Pokrovsk. As you know, the territories south of Pokrovsk, namely Novopavlivka and the surrounding areas, are under the control of the Russian army, and active fighting is currently underway in Chunishino. Most of Lysivka is under the control of the Russian armed forces, and active fighting is now taking place in the eastern territories of Lysivka, as well as in Sumy Yar. In turn, there are minor changes near Mikhailivka and Mirnohrad. Today, updated information was received on the territories of the pocket between Kazatske and Mikhailivka, and this territory, marked in grey, is now under the control of the Russian army. And now active offensive operations towards Kazatske are continuing. Combat operations are also underway in the populated areas of Kazatske and Promin themselves, and offensive operations towards Mirnohrad are continuing. A small piece remains under the control of the AFU. However, the map has not been updated, and half of these territories are already under the control of the Russian army, and the clearing of these territories is now underway. Let's move a little north on the map towards Krasnyi, Lyman and Rodinske. As you know, from the side of Novoekonomichny, the Russian army took control of these territories and approached the eastern outskirts of Mirnohrad. And now, active combat operations are already underway here. Combat operations are also underway on the northern outskirts. Some territories are already under the control of the Russian army. Most of Krasnyi Lyman has also come under the control of the Russian armed forces, and active fighting is ongoing in Rodinske itself. However, for more than 2 weeks, there have been no updates to the map here, and no news has been received. Combat operations are ongoing. In turn, the Russian army has expanded its zone of control north of Rodinske towards the supply road leading to Pokrovsk. However, the AFU have concentrated personnel near this supply road and are preventing the Russian army from approaching it. Active combat operations are continuing north of Rodinske. Let's zoom out the map a bit and look at the corridor to Petrovka and Marievka. As you know, this entire corridor is still under the control of the Russian army, and not long ago, the zone of control was expanded in favor of the Russian army, and Rubezhnoye is now completely under the control of the Russian armed forces. Active combat operations are also underway in Zolote, Kodiaz, near Hruska, Chasiv Yar, and in Petrovka and Marievka. Most of Novoye is currently under the control of the Russian army, and now active offensive operations are continuing towards Volodymyrivka, as well as towards Kharkiv, and some territories of Volodymyrivka are already under the control of the Russian army. In turn, Poltavka and Rusin Yar have long been under the control of the Russian armed forces, and the expansion of the zone of control in favor of the Russian army towards Sofiivka is continuing, and some territories of forest belts and fields have come under the control of the Russian armed forces as of today. Also, in turn, the Russian armed forces are conducting launches with FPV drone crews on AFU deployment sites in the populated areas of Kharkiv, Sofiivka and Toretsk. And active combat operations are already underway in the populated areas of Vilna and Stepi. We continue to monitor the developments in this direction and move on to the Kostyantynivka direction. Today we have significant changes here. As you know, Kyiv and Khatnie have long been under the control of the Russian army. However, the AFU is trying to counterattack here towards Kyiv, and now active fighting is underway on the northern outskirts of Kyiv. In turn, the Russian army is expanding its zone of control towards Pleshevka and Ivanopilia, and they are also conducting active combat operations here. And information was received from Alexandro Shiltino. At the moment, this entire populated area has been completely cleared and is under the control of the Russian army. As for this huge pocket of territories, the southern part of these territories is currently cleared and has come under the control of the Russian armed forces. Active offensive operations are continuing in the northern part of these forest belts and fields, as well as towards Predtekine. In turn, active fighting continues in Predtekine, but no updated information has been received from there. The Russian army has also approached the southern outskirts of Kostyantynivka and has established a foothold there. And this entire territory, marked in grey, is already under the control of the Russian army. And from this point, video footage came in showing that the Russian armed forces are located here, and now active combat operations are already underway on the outskirts of Kostyantynivka. Stupochki is also under the control of the Russian army, and offensive operations towards Predtekin are ongoing. Let's zoom out the map a bit and move to the Chasiv Yar direction. Most of Mikhailivka is under the control of the Russian army, and active combat operations are continuing in Chervon. The territories south of Maiske have also long been under the control of the Russian armed forces, and combat operations are continuing in Maiske itself. Zolote, as well as the adjacent territories up to Novopavlivka, are also under the control of the Russian armed forces. Active combat operations are continuing on the southern outskirts of Novopavlivka, but the populated area itself is under the control of the AFU, and offensive operations towards the populated areas of Markov and Novomykhailivka are ongoing. And now let's move on to the Siversk direction. As you know, it is quiet for now in the entire Siversk direction. Some territories are already under the control of the Russian army, specifically Vyimka, Ivano-Daryiivka, and Serebryanka, with the adjacent territories. And now active offensive operations towards Siversk are ongoing. As for the territory of the Serebryansky forest, most of this forest has already been cleared and is completely under the control of the Russian army. However, active combat operations are continuing on the southern outskirts of this forest, as there is still a presence of AFU personnel here. In turn, the Russian army continues its offensive actions towards Dronivka from the side of Serebryanka. And today, updated information on the territories was received, and this part of the territory, specifically the forest belts and fields, came under the control of the Russian army, and active offensive operations are continuing towards Dronivka, Platonivka, and Zakitne, as well as the populated area of Yampil. However, in turn, the Russian armed forces are conducting launches with FPV drone crews on AFU deployment sites in the populated areas of Dronivka, Platonivka, Zakitne, and Yampil. Let's move a little north on the map. As for the populated areas of Zelenyi and Torske, they are completely under the control of the Russian armed forces, but there is still a presence of AFU personnel on the western outskirts of Zelenyi. And now the Russian army continues to press here, and gradually some territories near Zelenyi are coming under the control of the Russian army. Let's move a little north on the map towards Shandryholove and Kodiaz. As you know, Kodiaz has long been under the control of the Russian armed forces, as has Zelenyi Dolina with the adjacent territories. And now information has been received about the expansion of the zone of control towards Novopavlivka and Berezove, and this entire corridor, marked in favor of the Russian army, has already come under the control of the Russian armed forces. Active offensive operations towards the populated area of Stavki are also continuing, and FPV drone crews are launching attacks on AFU deployment sites in this populated area. In turn, active combat operations are already underway in Novopavlivka and Berezove. It is quiet for now in Shandryholove, but active combat operations are ongoing, as in Sredny. However, the northern outskirts of Sredny and some territories up to Kharkivka are currently under the control of the Russian army, and active fighting is now underway in Kharkivka itself. Let's move a little north on the map towards Redkodub, Khatnie, and Novomykhailivka. As you know, not long ago, counter-offensive actions were conducted by the AFU towards Redkodub, and most of this populated area is currently under the control of the AFU. Active combat operations are now underway on the southern outskirts of this populated area. Khatnie is completely under the control of the Russian army, but it is unclear who controls Novomykhailivka, as counter-offensive actions were conducted here by the AFU, and now active fighting is ongoing in the center of this populated area. However, this territory is contested, and no updated information has been received yet. Combat operations are ongoing in this populated area. Orikhiv is completely under the control of the Russian army, and active offensive operations are continuing towards Orlivka and Lyubivka. Let's zoom out the map a bit and move to the Kupyansk direction. From the southern side of the Kupyansk direction, offensive operations towards Kupyansk itself are continuing. Combat operations are underway in Hlushkivka, near Stepova Novopavlivka, and offensive operations towards Pishane are also continuing. As for Kupyansk itself, we also have significant changes here. Some territories that are now colored grey have come under the control of the Russian army today, and active offensive operations into the center of Kupyansk itself, from the northern outskirts of this populated area, are ongoing. And now active combat operations are already underway in the center of the populated area of Kupyansk. In turn, the AFU is trying to counterattack towards Moskovka, as well as towards Radkivka, and some territories have currently come under the control of the AFU. Combat operations are underway in Moskovka itself and near Radkivka, in the forest belts and fields, and also in Sobolivka. However, no updated information has been received from Sobolivka yet. We continue to monitor the developments in this direction, and let's move north on the map towards Khatnie, Ambane, and My Love. As you know, My Love and the adjacent territories up to Khatnie and Ambane are already under the control of the Russian army. However, Khatnie and Ambane are under the control of the AFU, and the AFU is trying to counterattack towards My Love from these two populated areas. However, in turn, the Russian army is trying to press towards these populated areas, and active fighting is already underway on the outskirts of these populated areas. However, the AFU is trying to counterattack towards My Love, bypassing these combat operations, and is also conducting launches with FPV drone crews on the deployment sites of Russian army personnel in this populated area. We continue to monitor the developments and move on to the Kharkiv direction. As you know, it is quiet for now in the Kharkiv direction, and for more than 2 weeks, no updates have been received from here regarding the territories. Active combat operations are ongoing along the entire line of contact. We continue to monitor the developments in this direction and move on to the Sumy direction, towards Yunakovka and Alexievka. At the moment, Yunakovka is completely under the control of the Russian army, and active offensive operations are continuing towards the populated areas of Maryin and Sadki, which are under the control of the AFU. Offensive operations are also underway from the side of Yablunivka, and this entire pocket of fields and forest belts is gradually being cleared and is coming under the control of the Russian army. In turn, the AFU is trying to counterattack towards Alexievka, as well as towards Novomykhailivka and some territories northeast of Kondrativka, as well as east of Andriivka, and southeast of Alexievka, have come under the control of the AFU as of today, and active offensive operations are continuing towards Alexievka, which is under the control of the Russian army, as well as towards Novomykhailivka. Udachne is also under the control of the Russian armed forces, but active fighting is underway in the populated area itself, and combat operations are continuing on the outskirts of Novomykhailivka and Alexievka. But no updated information has been received on the populated areas themselves. We continue to monitor this direction, and that's all for today on the map and news. Thank you very much for watching. Be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new videos, and always stay up to date with the latest events and news.